Good evening.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Maybe before we do anything else, let's say a big welcome to Danielle Allen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So on behalf of Oregon Humanities, I want to say a big welcome to all of you. This is the fourth and final installment of our 2018-19 Think and Drink series on the theme of journalism, justice, and democracy. And thinking about that, there's really no person in the world that I can think of who speaks more to those three things and how they go together, speaks both with her words and with her actions than Danielle Allen. And we are delighted that you're here.
Thank you. Happy to be here. It's really, Portland is beautiful, I have to say. What a gorgeous place.
Sometimes.
Oh, yes. Okay, well today, definitely.
Yeah. So what we're going to do, I'm going to say some thanks quickly. I'm going to ask you some questions, just briefly, which I'll ask you to respond to with noise, mainly to help give Danielle a sense of the room. We'll talk for a chunk of time, and then we'll invite questions from you at a microphone over there. When we conclude the formal part of the evening, Danielle will be signing her new book, newish book, Cuz, right at a table over there, and we'll also ask you to stay and talk to each other. And we'll have food in the back. We'll have a question to encourage possible things to talk about related to what we're talking about.
Very cool.
So that's the shape of the evening. The thanks. First of all, I would like to thank the Oregon Cultural Trust and the National Endowment for the Humanities for making so much possible, not just specific events, but organizations to live in the world and do this kind of work. So a big thanks to those two institutions. For supporting this series, I want to thank the Kinsman Foundation, Tonkin Torp, Northwest Natural, and Stoll Reeves. So a big thank you to all four of those organizations. Two media partners, both of whom have also helped not just get the word out, but also help with additional programming, X-Ray FM and Bridgeliner, both doing really interesting work in journalism, so thank you. And then the Agora Journalism Center at the University of Oregon, also a big thanks, a community partner there, so thank you.
Nice.
The last thank you before turning to questions right now is just I want to thank so many of you who I think in lots of ways support and participate in this work, both with financial gifts, with leading programs, participating in programs, connecting organizations, and just supporting this work. So while you're here and while we have you, thank you. It means a lot.
Good job, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you. Say thank you to yourselves.
So first of three questions getting increasingly difficult to answer with applause, but the first one should be pretty clear. If this is your first Oregon Humanities Think and Drink, could you make a little noise, please?
Wow, that's great. That's great. Welcome.
If you're coming back for an additional Think and Drink, can you make a little noise? Okay, that's good. Okay, I think these next two questions are going to be harder to answer in this way and are probably unfair to ask. If you, in some way, feel personally connected to the justice system, could you make a little noise? And last question before we jump in, if you have a clear sense of what you think equality in this country should look like, could you make a little noise?
Okay, we've got some things to talk about.
Yeah, that should have given you everything
That's great.
you need. So, Danielle, you have written about and worked on all sorts of things related to justice and democracy, and your most recent book about your cousin is about both and about much more. And instead of diving directly into that, I wanted to ask you just to go back, your first book, which is about the politics of punishing in ancient Athens.
It sounds dry, doesn't it?
I wouldn't have said that.
It
no.
is.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask, for someone who, with your career, you've been committed to justice and democracy, and I wanted to ask, why punishing? Like, why do you care, have you cared about punishing?
It's pretty simple, and at the end of the day, I think it's the same answer anybody who writes a book gives, which is that it's something that mattered in my life. So I was a kid who grew up in Southern California. I was fortunate to go away to school to Princeton on the East Coast, big old fancy place. And my sophomore year there, I took a class on Athenian democracy. To this day, I don't know why. Like, I just sort of randomly wandered into this class. The teacher was just completely magnetic and compelling, and I loved the class. But we were reading reams and reams and reams of Athenian court documents, speeches, defense speeches, etc. And after months of reading these things, in class one day, I asked the question, these people, they didn't have prisons? Because I suddenly realized, I was reading all this stuff about courts and there wasn't a single mention of prisons. And my professor said, that would make a great dissertation topic.
Okay.
So that's basically what happened. And it was really just the fact that I was this kid from Southern California who grew up in Southern California in the 70s and 80s, and prisons were just growing everywhere around me. And then being kind of confronted with this other world that looked so different, I was just sort of shocked into awareness in a certain kind of way. And then I just sort of deeply grateful that I had a professor who didn't say, oh, like, that's not a question that belongs in a classics department, right? But, like, registered that this kid from Southern California kind of could see something about our world that the grown-ups weren't seeing yet. And so that led me on a journey to study punishment and think about it, you know, deep in time, all of history across the globe and so forth. And then the great privilege of having done that scholarly work is that I can stand up and say for a fact that the world has never seen a system of incarceration like the one this country has built. So that was the sort of result of that journey that just started from a kid's observation about the difference between the past and the present.
When you say that the world has never seen a system of incarceration like this one has built, what do you mean?
Just the magnitude of the American penal system. There's literally never been anything on this scale. And that's not just, I don't mean that you know, the world's population has grown and therefore there are more people in prisons. I'm sure you guys all know the numbers, right? That we have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its incarcerated population. The rates of incarceration per 100,000 people are the highest that the world has ever seen. That means, you know, higher than the Soviet Union, higher than South Africa during apartheid. You know, it's really extraordinary stuff, in fact. And we did it. You know, it didn't happen accidentally. It's the result of our laws, our policies, our choices. And we often sort of talk about the concept of American exceptionalism. One of the very sad facts about American exceptionalism, like, this is a part of our exceptionalism. Like, we built the biggest system of incarceration the world has ever seen.
Yeah, not the kind of exception we hope to be.
No.
But
So we got to unbuild it.
So we got to unbuild it. Maybe we can talk more about what unbuilding that would be, but I want to ask a little more about moving towards cause, I think, because in a way, even what you just said about numbers and how you came to the question of punishing sounded like it was the world around you, a little bit out there, and numbers and information. And then at the same time, almost in parallel, it seems like you're having this experience with a cousin who's very close to you.
So there's something slightly mysterious about all of this in the sense that, yes, I mean, my book, Cuz, is about my beloved, beautiful baby cousin, Michael, who went to prison on a first arrest at the age of 15 in 1995 in Los Angeles for an attempted carjacking. And it was just after California had passed the 3 strikes you're out law, and the carjacking was attempted in the sense that his victim wrestled his gun away from him and shot him through the neck. And on the way to the hospital, Michael confessed that he had also robbed 3 other people earlier that week by gunpoint. So it was a terrible week of violence. There had been nothing like that in his life previously. We were all completely taken by surprise and shock. But the result of the fact that he'd done these 4 things in 1 week is that he was facing 3 strikes on his first arrest. So the judge told him that, if he went to trial and was convicted on these things he'd confessed to, he would get 25 years to life. And so he took a plea deal, got a sentence of 12 years and 8 months. There's a lot to talk about what happened to Michael, but to come back to the mysterious thing, Michael's arrest came 4 years after I asked this question in class. So it wasn't actually my cousin's experience that prompted that early question. It was really the fact that kids see stuff. And that's sort of the message I want to drive home. It's like young people can see how the world is changing earlier than grown-ups often do. And that's what my question really came from.
It's interesting thinking about what you see and sort of when you start to see what's there in front of you. And one of the phrases that stuck out was that you said you and your family, as Michael became more involved with the justice system, had faith in the reasonableness of the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And that faith crumbled pretty quickly. But why faith in the first place, and how did it go away?
So that's another mystery. I truly have a hard time answering that question. It's the experience of African Americans in this country is deeply complicated. And, you can have deep family histories of oppression. And my dad grew up in northern Florida, which is like deep south, like it's basically the same as southern Georgia, Alabama, et cetera. Lots of lynching in his youth. It's like that's why he left the South. Like that's the story he tells about why he left the South. But at the same time, somehow he also has always had this incredibly deep love of American democracy. Mm-hmm. And how it is that a people can hold those two things together is just one of the deep mysteries of American life. But we do somehow. Yeah. And so I think that somehow that love of democracy, and probably partly as sort of, still building on the optimism of the 60s and 70s, sort of engagement with civil rights movement and things like that, did mean that we came into the process with Michael respecting lawyers, respecting the idea of justice, and so forth. I think the other important thing about the kind of mismatch between our expectations and what was going on is just that it was a point when the laws were changing really, really fast. So, the 3 strikes you're out law had just passed. And like the fact of the matter is, if you hear 3 strikes you're out, what do you think? Well, yes. And you think it takes 3 times for the law to apply. Like it just will not occur to you intuitively that it will apply the first time. Right? It's like we didn't go into the court proceedings recognizing that law would apply to 15-year-old Michael who just had his first arrest. Like we thought that law was for people with really screwed up repeated times. And relatedly, they had just changed the law to lower the age at which somebody could be tried as an adult to 14, 6 months earlier. And so all these changes were like a kind of earthquake deep underneath the ground of society. And it takes people longer than you'd expect to assimilate just the fact that the law's changed and that your vulnerability is seismically different in its proportions than it had been 3 years earlier. So that was a part of the story too.
It's interesting sort of understanding, and then also I'm wondering about sort of what it felt like as the reality of Michael's situation emerged. I try to convey it in the book, but it's just a sense of just repeatedly understanding too late. Mm-hmm. That the moment you understand is also the moment you can't do anything about it anymore. And it's a devastating feeling. Yeah. And in a way, I feel like I shouldn't be asking about it. And on the other hand, I feel like the book is an attempt to share that feeling. And for a family that was so well equipped, better equipped to understand than almost any family I can think of in the country.
Well, it's embarrassing too, all these educated people. Michael was from a family with my dad had a PhD and a couple of teachers in the family. And so it's not as if we didn't have resources to bring to bear to trying to think our way through this process and understand it and so forth. And even so, we never found our feet, couldn't find our way through the system, figure out how to get it to operate in ways that were even decent and fair. I mean, yes, Michael deserved punishment. He'd done something bad, and I wouldn't challenge, I don't dispute that to this day. He did not deserve 12 years, 8 months. I will absolutely dispute that. I think there's a completely different way we ought to approach sanctions for especially juvenile offenders. There's a lot to talk about there. But no, we couldn't find our feet. And I think there's a deep truth in that the criminal justice system is just opaque in numerous ways. And you think you're a kind of functioning, competent adult, and then the moment you get caught up in it, you're not anymore. And so recognizing that kind of feature of our justice system, like that's not what justice is supposed to do. Justice is supposed to be one of those things that keeps people empowered and civic agents, even when you're dealing with something like sanctions for wrongdoing. So.
Can maybe stick there for a minute? That's not what our justice system is supposed to do. Here's what our justice system is supposed to do. In that last sentence you talked, that seemed like there was a lot in there.
Right.
So what do you think our justice system is supposed to do?
Well, so this is what's like, it literally drives me crazy. So people forget that the first function of government should be the administration of justice. That is, the quality of any political system should be judged first by the quality of how it administers justice. And that's why stories about Solomon in the Bible are so important and things like that. It's the first job. It's the first job. We think budgets are the first job. Budgets are really, really important. But actually, the first fundamental grounding job is how you administer justice and whether you can establish conditions of fairness. And my belief is you cannot have a healthy society if you don't have a healthy system for administering justice.
Even that phrase, administering justice, and earlier you used the word wrongdoing.
Right.
I mean, if I ask as general a question as, what should wrongdoing be met with?
Right. I'm going to answer your question, but I'm also going to actually backtrack 2 notches in the conversation, and then I'll come back to your question in a second, because you said something that I wanted to pause on for a moment. You said, I'm not even sure I should be asking you this question, but you sort of talked about it, because this is a hard story. And I just wanted to say something about that for a second, because it's something I've been wrestling with. It is a hard story, and readers tell me it's hard to read. That's sort of probably the most common thing I hear about the book. I mean, people also thank me for it in various ways, but they do consistently tell me it's hard to read. And now this produces a bit of a conundrum, right? Because it's sort of hard to stand up and say, hey, everybody, read this book that's going to make you feel really, really sad, right? And yet, that's kind of the thing that has to happen. So I'm just saying that out loud, because I want you to know, the book hurts. And it's a strange thing to have written a book that people tell you hurts them. It's not my intention to hurt anybody at all, period, in writing the book. But it is the fact that I was trying to show and make feelable for others the kind of hurt experienced by my family.
Yeah, which there are good reasons for us to hurt.
Right, exactly. But so I just wanted to be honest about the fact that it's a kind of strange relationship between a writer and a reader to have that be one of the things that's happening. So this isn't exactly an apology. It's not an apology, but it's an acknowledgement, I guess. It's an acknowledgement that, I am sharing pain, and I'm, to some meaningful extent, sorry to have to bring pain into other people's worlds, but I do think we have to make visible the kind of pain that our approach to administering justice produces. So that gets back to your question.
Yeah, it does very artfully.
Answer your question too if you'd like, but you'll have to tell me if you still want me to.
Well, I do, but I also want this idea of the necessity of that pain being felt by people who are not in your family.
Right.
Feels to me like the challenge you're writing about, not only in Cuz, but in other books as well. That is, how do I feel the pain that is not mine, but is pain that is part of the community I live in.
Right. That's nicely put. So when I was first giving talks from the book, I found it a little hard to talk about. And I had a friend who gave me really good advice, which was that what mattered actually was less my story than other people's stories. And that what I needed to recognize was that by sharing my story, it would make it possible for other people to share their stories. And I soon found that that was true, that I would talk about the book and then afterwards sort of do book signings, and people would share their stories with me. And I ended up having the strange feeling of being a butterfly collector. Like, it was just my job to be sort of there with my net, collecting stories. And so there's two other things to say about that. One is, there are approximately 2.2 million people behind bars right now. And that, the numbers, praise be, starting to come down a little bit, but has been consistently in that order for going on 2 decades. Just think about the number of stories that represents, and then think about the number of stories you actually hear. And then you have to measure the magnitude of the silence, the gap between the stories that are out there and the stories that you hear. And that's the thing that makes me think it's really important to get these stories out, to hear them, to be a story catcher. And then it makes me want to ask the question, I guess a question I have for all of you that I would add to your after event question would be, how can an author, what's the right way for an author to open up and share pain without harming readers? That's the question I have that I'm sort of wrestling with.
Yeah. And what's interesting too is the shift, I think, from yourself as a family member, and you refer to Michael in the book as your baby.
Yeah.
So not just a family member, but the strength of that connection, and then trying to take the difficulty you're experiencing and make it something that we, broadly understood, reckon with and learn from.
Right, yeah.
That's a whole lot. That's a lot to ask of a person to do that. And I feel like in places, not just in Cuz, but in other books, in talking to strangers, I think you talk about democracy that way, that democracy requires something like that painful experience you're talking about, which is a tall task. It
is. It's a big ask. It's a big ask. So yes, I think coming to the concept of democracy, it's ultimately, I believe, alive in the relationships we have with each other, which means we have to see each other as people, and that is where you get to the hard work of listening as well as talking. And then the question of whether or not, across the incredible divergences of experience that we have in our world, it's possible to find those points of sharing, points of common connection. But I think you can't always find those points of common connection without wrestling through the contradictions and the forms of pain and the ways some benefit and others suffer. And the pictures of benefit and burden are very distributed in really complicated ways. It's not straightforward at all. And sometimes the people that we think are most burdened have benefited in ways that are surprising, and being able to see that too is just incredibly important.
Feels like we could go in a few directions, but I want to go back to you talked about the silences a minute ago. And in places, I think you sound, in a way like your father, you sound very hopeful about democracy.
Yes, true.
And we're talking about some really tough stuff.
Right.
You ask a question at the end of Cuz, which has stayed with me since the first time I read it, and I feel like it's actually become the way I think about the challenge of democracy. And I want to just read it out because it's a short question, but it is. Let me find it. It's about damage. Can we damage ourselves less than we ourselves are damaged? To me, that's like the core question about democracy.
Yeah. It's just the core question of life, though, too, right? It's the core question of any family, right? Every family has the stuff the previous generation did to each other, that the kids were caught up in, and the kids were damaged and suffered in various ways. And so somehow or other, because at the end of the day, here we all are on this planet trying to flourish, right? Just trying to flourish, like flowers blooming or anything else growing, trying to be whole and healthy in the thing that we are, the kind of creature that we are. And to have that, you somehow have to resolve the damage from the generation that precedes you, right? You have to sort of free yourself from it. And I think that sort of picture of life in a family is the same as the picture of life in a democracy. So I'm optimistic about democracy just because, I've pushed and pulled the question of how do you build worlds where human beings can flourish. And it doesn't matter how I push it and pull it, the answer always comes out the same way, that it requires democracy. Because if you don't have democracy, then people don't get the chance to shape the world they live in. And if you don't shape the world you live in, you're subject to constraints and imposition consistently. You don't get to be the author of your own life because the whole world's been built around you by other people. So in democracy, no, you don't get to control the whole thing yourself. You can't just project your will into the world and have everything change the way you want it. But at least you get to be a co-creator in the kingdom of culture, as Du Bois says. You get to help shape the whole world and then live inside constraints that are partly of your own making. And that, I believe, is where liberation comes from and empowerment. And then those things are the sources of human flourishing. So again, a push and pull. I think this way, that way. Could you build a world this way? Could you build a world that way? And I always come back to the notion that democracy is the only thing that provides all the bases for possible human flourishing. So I got to be committed to it. I'm definitely stuck with the concept of democracy. And if I'm stuck with the concept of democracy, I definitely want it to get better, not worse. And so there you have it. There I am on my path, working, trying to make it better. Because what else am I going to do,
So I feel what's great about it, there are so many things in what you said again that I want, and there are two things I don't want to lose.
I
One
still
is,
didn't even answer that other question from way back.
It was probably a lousy question.
Answer it before we're done. I want to answer that one.
We'll post it somehow. You've said a couple times that we can kind of learn about democracy by looking at family.
Yes.
And that seems interesting and questionable to me.
Sure. You're not the first person who said that. Yeah, no, so I'm not using the picture of a family as a place where love is easy or comfortable. I'm using a picture of a family where love is hard. And I like to invoke the concept of sibling rivalry. And, we talked about, I studied ancient Greece, and in addition to history, just read tragedies. Yeah. And tragedies are always about brothers killing brothers, right? So basically, family can be really tough stuff. And that's the kind of family that I think about, actually, as the basis for my thought about democracy. So that at some level, somewhere in there in that mix, you know that there's a reason to be connected. You may have lost sight of that reason. You're entangled with each other in ways that make it hard to avoid fighting, actually. And you can also see somehow that life will be better and richer if you can convert that intensity of entanglement and commitment into something that supports the flourishing of all members of the unit. And so that, I think that's a reasonable way of connecting the family and democracy. You're going to push me on that one?
It's my job.
Fair enough. All right. Okay.
And I do actually want to push it a little more. I'm sorry. Even though I love, I actually resonate with that description of family. That just sounds right. Okay. So thank you for that. But I still think, especially now, it feels like the challenge is around, to put it as briefly as possible, the word we.
Sure.
The we and we the people.
Yep.
So to be hopeful about democracy, I think, is to be hopeful about that.
Yes, that's true. All right, here we go again. So basically, this is where nothing that I say makes any sense if you can come up with a better way of organizing human life than democracy. Okay, so I just want to say that. It's like if you have something better than democracy, then you do not need to agree with anything that I say. But if you don't, okay, then the following things pertain. So democracies die unless you can maintain unity. Well, what does that mean? That was super abstract. What that means is to have a democracy, you have a process where in every decision somebody loses. Right? Always. There's always a loser. We focus on the winners, but there's always a loser in every decision. And when there are losers, in a world that isn't kind of focused on how you get unity out of that mess, eventually you have secession, civil wars. You know, that happened here, but it's happened all over the world, not just here. Democracies break up. The greatest weakness of a democracy is its tendency to break. And that's kind of straightforward because, like, who wants to lose? Yeah, it's a bummer. So at the end of the day, democracies can only endure if losing isn't that bad, which means you have to have what the novelist Ralph Ellison called, you have to recognize that democracy is a winner-take-nothing project. All right, so what does that mean, actually? It means a couple of different things. So Mitch McConnell, for example, talks about politics in a completely different way. That won't be so, he doesn't agree with me. His picture of politics, like his mantra for politics is, winners make policy, losers go home. That's a recipe for breaking democracies. The mantra should be, winners get the leadership role in a policy process that includes losers. Okay? But that means you actually have to be committed to concepts of compromise. You actually have to be committed to concepts of partial victories, of leaving some stuff on the table but getting some of the stuff that you want. Those are hard commitments to maintain over time. And so, yes, at the end of the day, if you want to preserve democracy, you have to choose unity. You have to make the we. Right? So yes, the we is under huge pressure right now. There's a whole lot to say about that and why it's the case. And we have to figure out how to dig ourselves out of this hole we've dug ourselves into. But choose unity. That's what you have to do.
It's interesting how in a way we stepped fairly quickly from Michael's experience at 15 to democracy and the question of unity. But
Right.
It seems to me this is like they're the same thing.
Yeah.
When you just said you have to choose this, you have to choose this, there are other imperatives driving people's choices and their sense of attachment.
Absolutely.
And I guess I want to ask, how can a principled commitment to the idea of democracy compete with some of the other allegiances we feel so strongly?
So that is a great question, and that does come back to this just deep conviction I have, again, about democracy as what enables flourishing. So again, I know these are sort of abstract words, and how do they connect to my cousin Michael, who didn't flourish ultimately? This country failed him. He made bad choices, but it is also the case that this country failed him. And the thing, I guess, is for me, it's just that I want a country that doesn't fail Michael's.
Yeah.
And I don't actually think I'll get that country by killing democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So even though I really, 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 really feel really angry at the people who passed 3 strikes laws and people who still defend them in some contexts, I can't let that anger drive my politics, because if I do, I risk losing the thing that I think could help the Michaels of the future. That's kind of my circuitous path to thinking about all of this.
So it's interesting, I have 2 other words from other places you've talked about this kind of stuff. One is a recent piece about Martin Luther King's political philosophy, and you talk about the principle of non-domination.
Yeah.
And then another word I want to add to that is, in talking to strangers, the word trust. Both of which seem hard to generate and sustain.
So they are, you know what, I'm gonna use this question as an excuse to answer your other question. But you'll see they connect, I promise. So you asked this question of how could we think about wrongdoing differently?
Yeah.
Okay? And there is a connection here. I like to ask people to get, I told you a little bit of Michael's story and the things he did at this age of 15 that came as, he'd literally done nothing like that previously. And I like to ask people to close their eyes and ask themselves the question of how should the criminal justice system respond to a kid who's done something like that? And I ask people to sort of take a minute and reflect on that. And then after they've spent a minute, usually it depends to where I'm asking this question, but very often people will say more or less, I don't know, like I don't even know where to start thinking about that. And then also, okay, take another minute and figure out what questions do you have that you would need answered in order to begin to think about what the right way of responding to a kid who's done something really bad, but it's the first time, he's a good student, there's other positive things, so the balance, et cetera. What other questions would you need answered? And the reason I ask these questions is because I'm trying to make the point that in the American public imagination, we have a blank space in our minds. Like, it's empty there. When I try to think, well, what else could we do to wrongdoing? Most people, you may be an exception, because I think Portland is an exceptional place. Most people have a really hard time coming up with any kind of answers. Our culture is so punitive that that's where our minds go. So I like to say, well, people have heard of like Angela Davis, abolishing prisons. Lots of people think she's like crazy, wild-eyed radical. But the fact of the matter is, like, it's not a utopian idea. You can buy a plane ticket and go someplace like called Germany or the Netherlands and see a place where they basically don't use prisons. So we use incarceration for 70% of our sanctions. In Germany, that figure is about 6% of their sanctions. In the Netherlands, it's 8 to 9%. In other words, it's possible to think about responding to wrongdoing and sanctioning people in completely different ways. They use a lot more of sort of work release programs, so people will spend the night in a surveilled space, but they can leave during the day and have apprenticeships programs and work programs. Their whole system in the Netherlands is built around what they call the principle of association, which is the idea that human beings are built to be with other people. And if somebody's done wrong and you want them to compensate the victim and make good to society, but you also want them to be able to do better when they're done doing that, you actually have to reinforce their positive social connections, not take them away from social connections, not put them in a set of like really badly structured social connections. So the entire system is built around how do you build positive social relationships around people who have done wrong, all right? Totally different world from ours. All you have to do is buy a plane ticket or begin to think about non-domination. Okay, now I have to explain that. So what that all meant was to say that picture of punishment is about recognizing that when something goes wrong, a way to think about wrongdoing is to recognize that there's a need for healing on a whole bunch of levels. The victim needs healing, the society needs healing, the wrongdoer needs healing. And what you're trying to do is build a world where nobody's dominating anybody else. And that involves making sure that the victim who's been dominated by the act of wrongdoing is redressed, is responded to. But it's also about making sure that the wrongdoer doesn't end up in a sort of state of perpetual domination as a result of the error that they've made. That you can get them to a place where they too can live freely, experience freedom without being subject to domination in an ongoing way. So the point I was trying to make is that this focus on trust, this focus on positive relationships, this focus on building a world where we're not trying to dominate each other, it leads to different concrete policies, like a different way of thinking about criminal justice, for example. It leads to different policies for how we might think about housing, a whole slew of other things.
Yeah, and in a way, as you were talking about that, I was thinking, even if you remove the criminal justice system question from it, the same challenges remain.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it almost seems like because there can be one approach to the world that says it's solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, we're competitive creatures by nature.
Right.
That we need to be changed in order to look for positive connections and look not to dominate. That challenge with the criminal justice system is actually just an amplified version of the challenge we face every day, living in community together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So no, I like to make this, I try to, economists are not really very good at appreciating community, in my experience, right? Because for economists, everything's transactional. It's about sort of the efficiency of the transaction. And a whole lot of our world is basically built around that concept now. I mean, it's how businesses run, it's sort of, how tech affects our world, where the number one principle designers use is efficiency. It's about that sort of transactional efficiency consistently. And I like to make the point that they're losing sight of the fact that human beings able to cooperate with each other produces efficiency.
It doesn't seem actually a complicated point.
Get it? Right? Like, when we can get along, things are easier and more efficient. Which means if you care about efficiency, you should probably care about community. So I try to tell my economist colleagues this. I don't know if I'm making much progress.
With more and less success. At the end of talking to strangers, you tell a short anecdote about family members of yours running into running into a woman who appears to be homeless in a restaurant, and your ex-husband now recognizing that person's voice.
Yeah.
And
it's this extraordinary story. I mean, my former husband grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up in Southern California as well, and we at a certain point got in the habit of spending our summers in Hollywood, where he'd grown up, and we were just, having a burrito in a local Mexican place one evening when he's like, I recognize that voice. A sort of disheveled woman, her hair completely matted and unwashed and tattered clothes and so forth. He's like, that's my cousin Marie. And it was. And for me, the moment was one that brought to life there's this Greek saying, there are gods even here. Anywhere you go, anybody you encounter might be a god. And you should take that hope and expectation with you into every interaction. And anybody might be your cousin Marie. And I mean, the beautiful thing is it did actually result in Bob, my former husband, looking after Marie for the rest of her life. So they reconnected and he took responsibility for her. Now that's obviously very particular, but the metaphor in it, I think, applies more broadly.
And it feels to me like in a way, it takes the family democracy almost so literally.
Right.
It goes, well, we actually are family.
Right.
And there's something about that story that's amazing, and there's something about that story that begs the question.
Right. It makes it too easy because she was
What if that
family.
woman was just that woman?
Right. Just the homeless woman on the corner.
Yeah.
No, I agree, exactly. And so that's where I do think we have to find the resources to stretch ourselves, push ourselves, and to figure out how to make room in our worlds for the people who need community connections with us. And that doesn't exactly mean that you have to empty yourself of care for yourself and your own projects. I do think, the sort of lesson of the airlines, that you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first, pertains, right? So in other words, it's not about sort of self-abnegation or complete selflessness. Building community is about being strong enough in yourself to have the self-confidence to pull others into your life and to connect to their lives. And to be doing that on a regular basis so that you're helping to kind of rebuild the stuff of trust, the stuff of a shared social life and community.
It feels to me like what you just said described some of the path you've been taking with your work. And I don't know in detail what that path has looked like, but from a distance, it looked like maybe 2 decades ago you were doing more strictly academic work. Mm-hmm. And now I couldn't summarize what you're doing because you're doing so many things that bridge the personal, the academic, the political, and even journalism. You're writing regularly in the Washington Post. You're at some significant expense to yourself putting your own personal story out there in a very different kind of book. And so I want to ask about that choice.
Right. To share the personal story?
To share the personal story and to not stay within academia, but really to move in both personal and public directions together.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's exactly been a choice. And so, I mean, even when I was a kind of baby scholar, assistant professor at the University of Chicago, I was always already doing things outside the university. So, and at some level, it was a just kind of very basic thing, which is, I sort of taught a night class for low-income adults when I was at the University of Chicago, which I started doing while I was an assistant professor. And I mean, the reason was just, I loved my students at the University of Chicago. They were fantastic, so these brilliant young people from all over the country. But the fact of the matter is, there were never any kids in my classes like my cousins. And I just I was kind of hungry for my cousins, I just wanted to be with them too. And take all of the goods and riches that the university had given me and be able to share it, yes, with these wonderful kids from great high schools from all over the country, but also with my cousins. I wanted to share it with both groups. And so I think just that kind of basic need to be with my people has just always meant that I've lived both in the academy and beyond the academy.
Yeah, and that points back to a word that has been beneath what we've been talking about, I think, and beneath democracy, and that's the word equality.
Yeah.
It's certainly there.
Absolutely.
And I guess I want to ask as you nod to hearing equality, when you hear that word, what does it make you think of?
Well, everybody else out here, they all said they knew the answer to that one.
That's what we're going to ask them about.
Oh, great. Okay, good. But they're not going to tell me now. I can't use their answers now.
We'll have food later. This place is going to stay open for a while.
All right. No, I love the concept of equality. I've written about it at length. And again, it's sort of where to start, because it means so many things to me. I'm trying to figure out what would be the pithiest thing I could say to tell you what it means.
Well, is it great?
There are gods even here. In every single one of us. That's for me what equality is. And then building a world around that recognition about the value of each and every human being. I mean, there's a lot more to say. We could talk about inequality and income inequality and political inequality and political equality and social equality and more abstract conceptions of human moral equality, but it really just comes down to that fundamental recognition that every life can and should be a beautiful story, and we together have the capacity to make that more likely to happen or less likely to happen.
Yeah, and the way that evocative short phrase, there are gods even here, again makes me think of the early sentence we talked about, that you had faith in the reasonableness of the criminal justice system, that there are gods even here is an achievement. It's a kind of,
Yeah.
that it takes a certain faith.
It does. I mean, I think that's a fair point, because life is hard, human life is hard, and we all get entangled in conflicts. And, who, locked in combat with an adversary wants to think about that adversary? Even here, a god, So, yeah, it's absolutely hard. It's like a willed thing to do, right? To will your way into the faith of living on the basis of this fact about human beings. And so, there are lots of different bases for that faith. Sometimes it's a religious basis. I don't think it has to be. I think that's a powerful basis, but it's also possible to have a commitment to human beings that comes out of just a deeply felt humanism. And I think those things can and should live side by side, things that can work together, that kind of deeply felt humanism and the sort of faith-based view about the value of human life. So.
Maybe I want to anchor a question like that as we get ready to transition to questions. I want to try to make it just a little more concrete and ask about practices. Sort of like practices that you have either come across, seen, been a part of, that you see actively building trust.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Fair point. Fair question. If you're going to complain about not enough trust, what are you going to do about it, huh? That was your question, basically.
I'll let you take it that way, sure.
So, yeah, there are lots of things, small things and bigger things. A small thing for myself that I do is, I feel slightly embarrassed to say this, but I'm ridiculously nice when people are nasty to me on Twitter. I'm like, oh, thank you for that interesting comment. But I believe in that. I'm doing that for a reason, because I'm wanting to reset the tone. And, the crazy thing about it is that, I'm saying what the ratio is, it's probably maybe 50% of the time when I do that, I find myself in an exchange with a person, which ultimately results in their apologizing. That caught me by surprise. That was not what I was expecting when I set out on my Be Ridiculously Nice campaign. But it actually works. People are sort of so pitched to presume adversarial relations that they're surprised when that's not what they find on the other side. So that's a teeny thing, but for me, it's making a difference.
Is there a cost for you to that?
Not really, no. So go for it. Yeah,
and what about if we bumped out from your interpersonal exchanges and thought at a community level or a society level? What do you see as some practices that you're optimistic about for building trust?
I'm sorry, can I just give you another really silly one?
Yeah.
If you don't mind. Because this one actually I also really love, and it's really surprising. I'm sorry.
We can stick with these all night. These are good.
It's just so basic. Okay, just try smiling. Honestly, just try it. When you're in a bad mood, try it. Smile anyway. Because when you smile, people smile back at you. And weirdly enough, it makes you feel better. So it's honestly, I'm serious. If you haven't tried this, you have to try this experiment. Okay? Promise me. Just one day when you're just feeling lousy, smile anyway and see what happens. It's like a miracle. Truly, it is. Human beings are phenomenal if you just approach them. And again, obviously, that's not the whole of the story. We do terrible things to each other, and we've got problems with structural racism and structural economic problems. Smiling's not going to fix those things. I don't want to pretend it is. All right? But it gets us something, okay? And I just want to say that.
All right. Thank you. I'm smiling.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
See, look, how good you feel.
It happens. And I'm going to point back to Michael for a minute there. I think that is something that he did.
He had a beautiful smile. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous smile.
And that it would come back in unlikely times.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a ray of sunshine. So, yeah. No, Michael was a really, really special person, and he was immensely talented. He was a brilliant writer, and he took college classes. He really wanted to go to school so badly, and it was that point in the prison system where they were just stripping all the education out of the prisons. No more classes, no more books in the library, et cetera. But we found these correspondence courses, and he got to write essays about Dante and Chaucer and so forth. And then started doing firefighting. So in California, when the book came out, I could say he fought the biggest wildfire in California history. And like 3 months later, that wasn't true anymore. Right. But at any rate, he wrote about his experience as a firefighter. And he wanted to be a writer. He had a lot of talent and ability. I guess didn't tell you the end of his story. Basically, he served his time. He served 11 years, and then 3 years after he was released, he was killed by somebody he met in prison. So that first arrest was the end of his life, basically. And he had so much to give. He gave it with his smile. He gave it with his words. And for years, he died in 2009. My book came out in 2017. So I had this box in my closet that had his essays and letters, and it was just like this box trapping a voice. Like there's this pulsing voice, source of vitality, like stuck in that box. And that was really, what I wanted to do was like get that voice out, let it be heard. And so for me, the best part of the book there's some photos of Michael with his smile, but also then the sort of centerpiece are his writing. So there's some of his essays, his essay about Dante's Inferno, the diaries from firefighting. And so my job was just sort of to like provide the setting, like when you're doing jewelry or something like that for the gem, which was this just gorgeous voice.
Which again feels like it's about democracy. It's how do we create conditions for those voices to be heard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that sort of comes back to what does it mean for any human being to flourish? It does mean that their voice is heard. Again, I love that line from Du Bois of being co-creators in the kingdom of culture. And that sort of, we had, so democracy starts in the 18th century, and it's, people really focus on political institutions and voting, and that's hugely important. And then you put alongside that economic questions. But then Du Bois has this brilliant insight that the whole thing runs, the institutions, the economic structure, on the basis of culture. The whole thing runs on the basis of culture and values, the values that we get from the stories we tell together. And consequently, like the deepest level of freedom and empowerment depends on the voices participating in that creation of culture. So that's where, again, getting stories heard, getting voices out is a really important part of the path to building human flourishing for everybody.
I think there could be no better segue to inviting questions.
Absolutely.
As we do, so the way we're going to do this is we're gonna. There's a microphone over here, and we'll try to take as many of them as we can in the next half an hour or so. We'll also take questions by some sort of tech that's being described up there. Before we go to our first question, can we just say a big thanks to Danielle?
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we go into questions from the folks here in the line, I want to take one of the questions that came in through Twitter from Tom Martin. He asked, I see more and more people are despairing, finding truth in journalism. Do you have a remedy for this despair?
Great question. Yeah, so, I am just incredibly impressed by the work of journalists. So the problem is, I think, less truth in journalism than in the kind of plethora of other sorts of materials that also circulate in social media. So I think journalists deserve a lot of respect. They're hardworking people. They push very hard to get the truth. But I think we all fundamentally need sharper skills of media literacy. And the paradox is that I'm sort of doing a lot of work on civic education at the moment. People tend to think of civic education as something that kids need. It's embarrassing to say, but it's actually the older generations that are doing the most to circulate misinformation and actually need more media literacy education. So that's one where it's reversed, actually, in terms of who really needs media. But I currently argue for universal media literacy, but the joke is that that is less about starting in kindergarten and more about focusing on older generations.
Hi, my name is Jody, and Danielle, I just wanted to say as a proponent of democracy, it's not too late for 2020, just if you're considering it. So,
Whew, man, I thought you guys were my friends.
we are friends now. So I'm just, my mind is kind of a web, so bear with me while I untangle this thought, and I'm partially asking it on behalf of my dad, but I'm just wondering, back to your point around democracy, I think particularly in Western, modern Western culture, particularly America, there is this connection between capitalism and democracy. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that connection and how it's maybe impaired or worsened the problem of mass incarceration in our country.
So there's a lot in that question. Thank you. Really important question. So just to say out loud, I'm working on an article for The Atlantic that directly addresses that question. So it should be out in the fall. So I won't give you the full account right now. But yes, versions of capitalism that developed in the middle of the 20th century and have defined our policy paradigms have done great damage to community, to policy making, to engagement, participation, and empowerment of our broad American people. Privatization of prisons is a terrific example of the problem. And there are alternative ways to think about productive economies. So I don't actually argue for socialism. I argue for a different approach to capitalism, which does recognize that point I made before about the value of cooperation and community for even efficiency. So you can take a lot of the good of capitalism, but structure it in different ways than we currently do, and in my view, achieve powerful economies that bring opportunity and egalitarian possibilities for people, but also respect what markets do, which is they are empowering and freeing in a variety of ways that too much top-down government structuring of the economy is a problem for. So, anyway, The Atlantic, September. Okay. Thank you, that was a great question.
Hello, my name is Rochelle Dixon. I want to first of all thank you for being here, and also I want to note that I'm a graduate of the HIP program. So,
awesome.
I'm currently vice chair of Multnomah County Democrats. I'm a co-chair for the NAACP Education Committee, among other things, and that's all credit to Adam Davis and Kyle and the people who pushed me through to be able to have a voice. So now that I have a voice,
woo! Awesome.
I'm using it like a lot, like
excellent.
Really a lot, on the radio, in person. So here's my question. So I was born into a Catholic family. I was born into a military family, and that makes me the kind of person who's really into punishment and punitive situations.
Right.
I enjoy the fact that there is a hell because I want some people to go to it. I've had to admit this. Okay, I've had to admit this. I enjoy thinking about hell, but that wasn't quite enough for me. So I had to go back to my Haitian roots and think about voodoo.
Voodoo as well,
and
yeah,
how I could use that for our benefit. So if anybody wants a Trump pin cushion, hit me up, because I got them. I got your Trump pin cushions, okay? But beyond that, what I understood as I began to age and progress, that punitive is not where it's at. So I began to understand more about a restorative justice kind of lens, But I wonder what in your background made you think of justice as being something that would be administered by the U.S. government that seems so far removed from anything that could be considered justice. We are on stolen land here today. I live on Custer Street. It drives me nuts every time I go home to see Custer Street. Custer never lived in Portland. He never lived in Oregon. Genocidal maniac. And so I wonder what figured into your perception that U.S. justice would ever be anything that actually would serve your nephew. I just got to ask, were you Catholic? Were you born Catholic? You're Catholic, aren't you?
Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. So it's not, I started off by saying it was a mystery. Like, that was the mystery I couldn't answer, was where that faith, that initial faith in the justice system came from. And I honestly can't answer it. So, your answers may be better already than my own. I tried to, that's why I sort of gave this account of, my father is a deeply patriotic person, despite the fact that he left the South to get away from lynchings. So that's what I mean when I say it's a mystery. Like, both of these things are true about my father. So I definitely acquired my kind of initial faith in the political system and in our political institutions from my father. So, how do you unpack that one? I'm still trying to figure that one out, to be honest.
Hi, my name is Bennett. You said all democracies fail eventually, especially when they lack unity. Of course, all governments eventually fail.
But not always by breaking up. That's the key thing.
Well, our democracy has flourished in times when we have prosperity widely shared, and I'm thinking of the post-war period up until about 1978, which is when we started building prisons. And this period now is, it seems to me, characterized by scarcity and fear. Mm-hmm. We're about to run out of Earth unless there's some technological solution. How does thinking about the climate crisis figure into your optimism for democracy?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So I just want to clarify one little thing from the top of your question, if you'll permit me, which is just that, yes, all governments fail, but they fail differently. So Syria is a good example of how autocracies fail, right? They fail murderously, like through murder of populations. Democracies fail by breaking into smaller bits. And so it's just sort of different ways, different kinds of political form fail. So that was sort of what I was trying to get at there. So if you care about democracy, you want to not break into little bits. But with regard to climate, we need a different politics around climate change. It's just very straightforward. So it's not, I sort of bring, in some sense, the same orientation to that topic as to others. That is, it's a problem that we plainly need to address, so let's get busy. But for me, the thing, and obviously lots of people are busy, so I don't mean to suggest that we're not, but for me, the thing that is important here, actually, and I don't know that you'll agree, is that we change the way we try to go about the politics of climate change. And what I mean by this specifically is, I think we've done damage to our ability to make progress by letting science claim too much authority for itself. And it's not like science is right. The science is right. This is not a criticism of the science from the point of view of what it's telling us about climate. But the scientists are not the people who decide policy. The people are the people who decide policy. And astonishingly to me, we've never actually had any kind of national commission process around climate change. And why? The reason that matters is just because technocracy, when you have sort of experts designing policy without driving it through the kind of conversational processes of the people, never secure legitimacy for what they're doing. From my point of view, that's the problem we've had with climate change, is our failure to drive the process of legitimacy that permit real decision making to get something done. So from my point of view, there's a lot that we could be doing to be really improving what the politics of climate change. This can sound crazy. I don't think it would be that hard to do. Actually, I think if, even for starters, if all state humanities councils drove conversational processes through all the states around this, where the point was experts are there and they're sharing their expertise, they're sharing their knowledge, they're producing the evidence, and then they're also asking people like what people care about, and given what people care about, what choices are we going to make together? I think we would already have a much more productive environment for successful action on climate change. So anyway, what do you think?
We're in. We just need to find the support for it, and we're in. Yeah.
Right. There's got to be people out there. I mean, there's the guy, Tom Steyer. He's a big climate activist as well, right? He's got lots of money.
My name is Ava, and I want to thank you very much for your information and sharing as well as you do all of your ideas. And my question has to do with the idea of what's clear to the people here and to you is a view of people who commit crimes as having some background and some stories, and that by understanding how those stories devolved into criminal activity. But there are, I would say, more people who think that there's evil, that there are people who do things because they're bad, and that there's no way to get around it. I'm watching Les Miserables, and Javier, is the example, the paradigm of that. And I'm wondering, how do you get people to change that perspective, or do you not do that and just hope that most people join your bandwagon?
So, no, I mean, you have to try to change people's minds. I think people won't just sort of join, without a motivation. But actually, that's where I do think stories matter a lot. I think stories do change people's minds, and this has been one of the great experiences of sharing the book. I've had judges tell me that it changed their mind about the people that they see in the court in front of them. Yeah, I'm like, what? It took this to change your mind? Anyway, but yeah, and so why is that exactly? Just to sort of make it a little more explicit, in the book I really try to kind of scrutinize the structure of choices for Michael, for society, for us, his family, and I don't try to put all the blame in any one place. Like, the blame lies everywhere. Michael has some responsibility, we as family have some responsibility, we failed him in particular ways, society failed him. But a concept that has become really helpful for me is the notion that the way our social world is organized means that different kids land in worlds with different degrees of difficulty in them. And in the last Summer Olympics, there was this gymnast who was doing this vault called the Pradhanova, something like that. Some of you may remember her. She was from India. And this vault is the one that has the greatest degree of difficulty in gymnastics, which means that the media coverage before she did her vault was very binary. It's like, is she going to make it, or is she going to break her back? Is she going to make it, or is she going to break her back? Like, this was what everybody wanted to know. And that's kind of like what this degree of difficulty concept is like for kids, too. Like, you can grow up in really bad neighborhoods and make it, but if you don't, you're going to break your back. Whereas a kid in another neighborhood will grow up, and if they don't make it, they'll get a broken arm. And that's, I think, just a really important way of capturing the relationship between individual choice and the vulnerability that young people are exposed to at sort of different degrees. So I've been using that degree of difficulty concept to try to change people's minds.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hi, Professor Allen. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and I feel on a daily basis that my clients' poverty makes it difficult for me to tell their stories, and makes it difficult for courts to appreciate the progress that they do make, because, insuring a car or keeping your phone on, keeping food in your refrigerator is actually a milestone for some of my clients. And I want those to be celebrated in the way that a college degree is, or a promotion at work, or those kinds of things. But Anyway, that's the sort of specific strand that's running through my thoughts as you speak. But my broader question, I guess, is you mentioned that we can fly to places where they have a radically different approach to prison and incarceration. West Germany West Germany? Sorry, Germany. Throwback Wednesday, or the Netherlands, or those kinds of places. And it always hits me like in a deep place in my stomach when we draw those comparisons. Like, Americans don't give a shit about those places because there's a level of economic equality in those places that doesn't apply here. And so when you look in a 60 Minutes episode, you look at those clean places and those people who can still visit with their families and have a stack of books on their desk. And to my mind, I think to myself, Americans would say, that's a windfall. Like, why would we reward bad behavior with that clean single unit room and that stack of books? We can't punish those poor people who commit crimes by giving them the penthouse apartment at the prison. So all of these thoughts, sort of run through my mind. And so my question, I'm sorry for the long wind-up, my question is, what would it take for us in our world here to embrace, to overcome some of that thinking, and to really embrace or grapple with these other models in these other societies that are more egalitarian in terms of their economies? I'm sorry for the...
No, it's a hugely important question. Thank you. So probably many of you have heard of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which is, really compelling account of many of the causes of mass incarceration as it currently exists. I don't know how many of you know what Michelle Alexander is doing now. Anybody know? So she quit her job as a law professor and took a job as a professor at Union Theological Seminary. And the reason is because she believes we won't be able to change the laws until we change our culture and our hearts. And so she's trying to figure out how to do that work. And I think she's basically right. But that's not in any way to step away from hope. It's rather to recognize that legal change is downstream from cultural change. So we're back to the stories, getting the stories told. We're back to sort of doing the work about changing the name of Custer Street. Because if Portland wrestles with that, Portland has to think about who Portland is and what kind of community Portland wants to be. What kind of community does Portland want to be? And that work of digging into our memory and finding the places where we tell very different stories about who we are, and some of those stories are damaging to us, and then fixing them and repairing them, sort of truth and reconciliation kind of work is part of what we need. Some of you probably know Brian Stevenson and his book, Just Mercy. Yeah, another great book. And he just has built this incredible memorial to peace and justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which is a monument to the 4,000 people who were lynched in different places around the country, mostly the South, but some in the North, too. People lose sight of that. Brian likes to say that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. And he came to believe in his legal practice in Alabama that his work with death row inmates and his work on exoneration cases was hampered by the kind of narratives that the sort of South had managed to produce over the 100 years from the end of the Civil War. And so he began to believe, as a lawyer, he had to change his focus and work on changing narrative, changing our basic the texture of our shared memories. So both Brian Stevenson and Michelle Alexander have decided that the thing we need to work on together is the stories we tell each other about the kind of community that we are. They're pretty wise.
Good evening, Danielle. I'd like to ask you your thought on this. Is it possible that we have romanticized democracy to a fault, especially with regard to equality? Is it possible that equality started out flawed? we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Negro, the slave, 3/5 of a person. A woman, not even that. And as we apply this idea of equality to American exceptionalism, it becomes even more messy. Just the second part of this to give context to it. I think when we look at birth into the family, it's not a democracy. It's autocratic, it's authoritarian. You go to the classroom, it's autocratic, it's authoritarian. You go to fraternal orders, it's not a democracy. And I guess what I'd like to ask you, while democracy is a beautiful thing from an ideal, but in practicum, it's flawed. And do you see the possibility of this new movement around equity possibly becoming the new civil rights movement that offsets the flaws of the failure of equality?
Thank you. So there are many layers to your question. There is a lot packed in there. And so there are places inside democracies for hierarchy. That would be the word I would use. And for me to say hierarchy, it's important that I distinguish. So there are legitimate forms of hierarchy and illegitimate forms of hierarchy. And for me, the key difference is whether or not the hierarchy operates on a principle of domination or not. So businesses are hierarchical, but businesses should be structured in a way that nobody is being dominated in the experience of the hierarchical relationship, which means rights for workers and employees, structures of fairness. There are lots of ways of bringing elements of democracy into the workplace in ways that make it function better for everybody, even while it's inside a hierarchical structure. So I just wanted to say that. That said, I don't think that the things that we use hierarchy for are different from what we need democracy for. And what we need democracy for is for the chance for all to have empowerment. You cannot have that through the other forms. And so for me, that's where I can't come back to things. Either you think everybody deserves the chance of empowerment, or you don't. If you do, then it's got to be democracy, even if you've got other stuff happening too. It's not, not like everything has to be democracy, but the sort of political form does. Okay, so but what about equality and equity? So where do those things fit in? So I want to just tell you a little story about the Declaration of Independence that we don't know. We generally don't know the story. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, what's the story we don't know? The story we don't know is that the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was an abolitionist phrase. It doesn't say property. That was for a reason. There is also a pro-slavery moment in the Declaration. The document is as compromised as the Constitution. But what people don't know is that the Declaration of Independence crystallized the abolitionist movement. The first person to use its language for a purpose other than independence was a free African American in Boston named Prince Hall, who submitted a petition to the Massachusetts Assembly in January of 1777 for an end of slavery in Massachusetts and emancipation. And by 1780, slavery had been ended in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Vermont. Abolitionism started at the beginning of this country, just as Southern domination, maintenance of slave system consolidated at that point. This country has always had an equity tradition, always. By equity, I mean recognizing that full realization of the equality principle requires total inclusion. Okay? So you're absolutely right that too many people in this country did not recognize that that's what equality requires. And in a certain sense, I think what we're all doing the work of is revising the principles of the Declaration to include the principle of total inclusion. And that's what equity work is about. Thank you for your question.
Hi. I'm Arabella Kelly. I'm a freshman at Franklin High School. And I just wanted to know if there is, since my generation typically doesn't have a lot of hope, like moving forward, like most people just don't even try at this point. Is there a way that we could use justice and all that to create hope within the community?
Hope so. Absolutely. Thank you for your question. Thank you for being here. Thank you for stepping up and using your voice. So it is a very sad and worrying feature of our world that what you are describing is the case, that young people don't have a lot of forward-looking hope, and more specifically, you may have seen a sort of statistic that the figure what percentage of millennials think that it's necessary or indispensably valuable, I can't remember the formulation, to live in a democracy. The answer is 27%. Right? Whereas from the cohort that was born just before World War II, that same question, what percentage think it's indispensable to live in a democracy? The answer is about 70%. So we do have a massive generational loss of faith in the possibility of democracy. And I believe we need to rebuild that faith in democracy, but you can't rebuild faith in something that's not working. And I do think that is one of our basic problems. And so that means, yes, engaging young people in justice work and succeeding at that work are really important ways to rebuild hope. In addition, I think we all collectively have to fix our broken political institutions, because there's no point encouraging people to participate in stuff that's broken, because it just makes them more cynical. So there's a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Yeah. We should make this the last question. Is that, are there three more questions? Can we make sure then that we, with respect for everyone, make them try to short?
Well, if you want, we could take three questions together, and then I can synthesize and try to respond effectively.
Sure. Hi there. My name's Anna, and I've been watching the increase in the racial dissonance and inequality that's happening in our country. And the thing that keeps coming into my mind is how entrenched we are with certain, we being, everybody, entrenched with certain attitudes regarding race and who's lesser or better. And in order to address that, you actually mentioned this a couple of questions ago, is that we truly need a cultural shift, because that those entrenched ideas of race are centuries old. Yeah. And so my question is, how do we propagate a cultural shift? Yeah. How do you do that?
Thank you. Thank you.
My name's Carol Witherill, and I've been greatly encouraged by the restorative practices movement in schools, in prisons, in families, and it seems to be now diminishing somewhat and thinning out, and it seems to me if our communities, schools, families could replace incarceration or juvenile detention with restorative practices and mentoring, that would be a great, great thing for democracy.
Thank you.
Wow, how do you follow these two great questions? Doctor, thank you for gracing our city.
Thank you.
I want to also thank you for your courage to speak truth on issues that many stay silent. There's a cost to that, and I thank you, and it's larger than the Twitter criticism.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Also, I want to thank you, facilitator. I think you did a great job, and you're doing a great job.
Bravo.
An observation, then a quick question. Doc, thank you for referencing the Declaration of Independence and that small but significant piece about property. John Hope Franklin, your colleague from Harvard, stated that it was an intellectual dishonest document. And a number of folks criticized him for that, but that was what he was referencing, was that critical piece that how am I free if I'm considered property? And so I thank you for referencing that. My question in context, well, first, what I hear you saying in your book is that let's take the power that mandatory sentences have and return it back to where it's supposed to be, which is in the hands of judges. Is that what I'm hearing?
That is definitely part of it, yes.
And I salute that because I don't think that's what Marbury and Madison meant. I don't think they would have authored a measure that takes the power out of the hands of judges when that case gave the judicial the power to make findings of fact. So I thank you for your book because it really speaks on two levels to that central point. My question and my point is, here in the city of Portland, there's been an interesting discussion about the governance structure. On one side of town, where issues are livability, healthcare, and sustainability, and on the other side of town, issues may be, chief issues are cats in the trees. And the city is comprised of 95 neighborhoods. And so there's been a recent report that was produced by a city club in reference to the governance structure, moving from an at-large structure in the city's 95 neighborhoods to an elected single-member district structure, which is one that I have taught and advocated for a long time. I'm a doctorate candidate writing my dissertation, and so I would like just to quote Professor Guinier to see if you agree as she references this topic. And Professor Guinier says, Guinier's research, which examined voting systems, asked the following question: are there factors that guarantee winners and losers? She contends that such factors do exist and that race is too often an important factor in the construction of voting districts, the outcome of elections, and ultimately political influence. Guinier argues that the political system must be rejuvenated to be more inclusive. Specifically, she called for the creation of electoral schemes that would empower all citizens. That sounds like single-member districts to me, Doc. So do you see that as a correlation to structural racism? And that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So those are great questions. A picture of a future we could have together around restorative justice, which I completely agree. And then questions about the cultural work and institutional work we have to do to get there. And I think it's really important to say we need both cultural work and institutional work. The cultural work can feel harder to access, but it shouldn't. Let me give you a couple of really small but concrete examples. Tobacco, mothers against drunk driving, marriage equality. All three of those things have changed our world, and the change depended on narrative work in all three cases, changing public opinion. So tobacco scientists got out there and started doing the work of educating people, changing public opinion before they even got the point to having policymakers litigate tobacco companies and so forth. Ditto, Mothers Against Drunk Driving worked really hard to change people's norms, their sense of values about how we think about cars and drink and things like that. And that was the groundwork for legislative changes. And ditto, marriage equality. The movement began to make much more dramatic progress when they switched from the frame of gay rights to the frame of marriage equality. because basically the sort of analysis of it is when it was cast as gay rights, what that meant was there should be something special for a special group and different group of people. But when it was cast as marriage equality, there's something like every human being should have a right to, and there's a group of human beings who aren't getting that. And that work really had a powerful impact on American culture and transformed how people thought about the issue of gay rights. So that was a very intentional strategy to develop the narrative of marriage equality to drive that conversation forward. So the culture work around equity in our historical narratives is doable. We just have to define it at the same kind of concreteness that some of these other efforts have. On the institutional side, yes, we need inclusive political institutions. I 100% agree with you. I don't agree about single-member districts always being the answer. I think they often are at the level of the city. I think that's correct. But actually, I argue for multi-member districts for Congress, okay? And it's important that these different mechanisms have a different implication at different levels of the system. But so yes, I think single-member districts in cities, multi-member districts for Congress, independent redistricting commissions, and ranked choice voting in a number of different places within the system are all changes that we need.
Nicely
so
done.
There we go. I think those were all three questions.
You might have even taken some that weren't asked. That was nicely done. So here's what we're going to do. In just a minute, we're going to break and shift to, hopefully, you will be talking more directly with each other and getting after the food and drink in the back of the place. Danielle will be signing copies of Cuz over here. I want to do two last things. One is, this is the end of our 2018-2019 series, and I just want to ask you to join me in thanking the staff of Oregon Humanities that has done an amazing job with this on. Some are here tonight and some are not here, but it's been really sustained, excellent work. And I want to build out of that culture work. I think that's what our organization is trying to do, is culture work. In April alone, we had, I try not to talk about Oregon Humanities work up here for lots of reasons, but I'm going to for a second. In April alone, we had 48 community conversations around the state. This past year, we had over 300 conversations on the kinds of topics that we've been talking about tonight.
Wow.
There are many dozens of people that have been trained to lead these kinds of discussions around the state and now in other places in the country. At the same time, we had a graduation for Humanity in Perspective, the program that Rochelle is talking about and that Danielle has taught in under a different name in Chicago and other places. We're trying to tell stories also in lower barrier ways, where people don't need to show up in a room, but in a magazine and online. They start to recognize the gods that are there in the stories they hear, in the people that those stories are about. So I just want to say, Oregon Humanities is one among many organizations doing this work. And as we go into a year and a half of attention to politics that looks like one kind of thing, the kind of thing that emphasizes one office and one person who's going to occupy that office, there's the kind of politics that Danielle is engaged in and talking about. And I think that's what Oregon Humanities as an organization is trying to do in partnership with many other organizations. I hope you will continue to look for those opportunities and strengthen them. And I want to thank Danielle for helping us in so many ways think about and strengthen that kind of commitment to democracy. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your great questions.